She was standing at my door at 10:30 on a Thursday night, holding her heels in one hand, her socks soaked through with November snow. The engagement celebration had ended early, she said. She'd left after 40 minutes. Desmond didn't know she was here. My name is Matthew Sterling. I'm 42 years old and I design neighborhoods for a living, not buildings but the spaces between them. Pocket parks, pedestrian corridors, the placement of benches and trees along city blocks so that people naturally slow down without knowing why. I've worked for the same urban planning firm in Calgary for 11 years, and I've gotten very good at understanding how physical space shapes the way people feel without their ever quite naming what's happening to them. I live alone now in a one-bedroom apartment on 17th Avenue Southwest. Not a large place, but it has a kitchen with good morning light and a balcony that faces west, where on clear evenings the Rockies turn a specific shade of pink before the sun drops behind them. I moved here after the divorce, 2 years ago, almost exactly. My routine hasn't changed much since then. I wake at 6, I put the kettle on, pull a maple cutting board from beside the stove, and slice whatever fruit is in season while the coffee steeps. Peaches through August. Apples deep into autumn. Whatever the Hutterite colony stand out on Blackfoot Trail is still carrying through December. The cutting board itself is nothing much to look at. Pale blonde maple, dark along the edges from years of oil and use, and a hairline crack running from the left corner that I've never gotten around to fixing. Elise bought it for me at the Inglewood Farmers Market on a Saturday morning in our first fall together. She carried it home under her arm, swinging it like a clutch purse, and set it on the counter and said, "This one has character." I use it every morning, every single morning. Elise and I met at a fundraiser for affordable housing in Bridgeland a little over a decade ago. She was coordinating volunteers for a local nonprofit, the kind of person who remembered every name in a room full of strangers and made each of them feel specifically seen. I fell for her somewhere in the third conversation. We got married 14 months later, in a small ceremony, at a vineyard outside Kelowna in September, and for a few years things were good in the way that good things are, when you don't yet understand how easily they can become invisible to you. The marriage didn't break for any dramatic reason. No betrayal, no secret, no single night I could point to and say there, that was it. It broke because I worked too much and said too little, and because Elise needed more than quiet. She needed someone who would ask how her day had gone and stop what they were doing to actually listen. I thought presence was enough. I'd sit across from her at dinner, laptop closed, physically in the chair, and believe that counted. It didn't. She told me this clearly, and without cruelty, near the end. We signed the papers on a Monday afternoon in February. She hugged me once at the door. She took the casserole pot and the photo albums and her grandmother's quilt. I kept the cutting board. 6 months before that Thursday in November, I heard through a mutual friend that Elise had gotten engaged to a man named Desmond. He was a senior partner at a commercial law firm downtown, the kind of practice that occupies 3 floors of a tower on 8th Avenue and has its name printed in small gold letters on the scoreboard at the Saddle Dome. I didn't know him personally, but Calgary isn't a large city, and I knew the type. Controlled, polished, the sort of man who took up the correct amount of space in every room he walked into and was aware of it. I read the text from our mutual friend, set my phone beside the cutting board, and went back to the apple I'd been slicing. I didn't finish slicing it. The only person who noticed was Terry, the project manager on my team. Terry had been working alongside me for 6 years and had the particular gift of reading people through what they didn't say. One afternoon, while I sat staring at a pedestrian corridor plan I hadn't actually been seeing for 10 minutes, he dropped a file on my desk and said, "Elise is engaged and you've been carrying it around like a load-bearing wall you're afraid to touch. When are you going to actually feel it?" I told him I was fine. He picked the file back up and walked away. So when Elise appeared at my door in November with her heels in her hand and snow in her hair, I didn't ask what was wrong right away. I stepped back and let her in. She looked around the apartment, the way you look at a room you've been trying not to think about. Slowly, methodically, her eyes landing on things. The plant on the window ledge she'd given me, the stack of planning journals on the side table, the cutting board on the counter, one apple beside it, half sliced because I'd abandoned dinner when she knocked. "I left the party early," she said before I could ask. She sat down at the kitchen island, sideways on the stool the way she always had, ankles crossed, and she said, "Can we make the white bean soup? I need to do something with my hands." I looked at her for a moment, then I said, "I have to finish the apple first." She laughed, a real laugh, startled out of her, and it loosened something in the room. We made soup. It was unsettling how familiar it felt. Not uncomfortable. Unsettling the way a city neighborhood feels when you return to it after years and your body still knows the distances between things. Elise opened the correct cabinet for the dried herbs without thinking. She reached past me for the wooden spoon on the hook by the stove, still there, always there, and started stirring without asking if that was her job. She minced the garlic the way her father had taught her, small and even, her knife rocking in that particular rhythm I'd watched 100 times in this same kitchen. I sliced the onion on the cutting board. The hairline crack caught the light from overhead. Elise glanced at it once, then she looked back at the pot and said nothing. We didn't talk much while we cooked. The silence had the texture of something old and settled, not empty, just worn in. She found the ladle in the third drawer. She tasted the broth and reached for the smoked paprika without asking, because she knew that was what it needed, because she was the one who'd taught me to use it in this soup in the first place. Over dinner, she talked about her life with Desmond. She talked about it the way someone reads the back of a box, accurate, thorough, and without any warmth. The house in Aspen Woods, the Audi he'd leased in her name. The client dinners at restaurants downtown where she sat and tried to think of intelligent things to say about commercial real estate law. She used the word supposed a great deal. She said she was supposed to be happy. She said things were supposed to be going well. I recognized that language. I'd heard it from her once before in the last months of ours. Halfway through dinner, her phone lit up on the counter. Desmond. She looked at the screen, then turned it face down. When I glanced up, her jaw was set. "He knows you're here?" I asked. She picked up her spoon. "He knows I left the party." She didn't answer the other question I hadn't asked. After dinner, we washed up the way we always had. She handed, I dried. When I put the cutting board in the dish rack, she lifted it herself and placed it back beside the stove, her fingers resting on the wood a moment longer than necessary. Her thumb traced the hairline crack, slow and deliberate, the way you check whether something has held. She left around midnight. At the door, she turned back and looked at the kitchen once more. A long, careful look, the kind that takes inventory. Then she met my eyes. "Thank you," she said. "I needed this more than I knew." After the door closed, I went back to the kitchen. The cutting board was 2 inches to the left of where I always keep it. Elise had moved it. I don't know if she did it consciously. 2 days later, she texted asking for the soup recipe. I sent it. 4 days after that, she wanted to know if the Hutterite colony stand on Blackfoot was still carrying canned tomatoes in November. I told her yes, through December if you went early. 5 days later, she showed up at my door with a jar of those tomatoes and a sourdough loaf. "I made too much this week," she said, as if that explained everything. Every visit had a reasonable excuse. Each one lasted a little longer. Every time I came back to the kitchen after she left, the cutting board had shifted. Terry noticed before I did. He saw me check my phone twice before noon on a Tuesday, something I hadn't done in 2 years. He saw the thermos from a cafe I only ever went to, with Elise sitting in my car's cup holder. He said nothing for 3 days. Then on a Friday afternoon, he stopped in my doorway and said, "She's engaged to someone else. You're relearning her coffee order. I just want to make sure you know where this goes." I told him Elise and I were reconnecting as people. He looked at me for a long, level moment, and then went home for the weekend without saying goodbye, which was his version of a full paragraph. Then Desmond came to my apartment. It was a Sunday afternoon. Elise was at the kitchen island showing me a photo on her phone, her ceramics class. She used to throw pottery in university and had just gone back to it. In the picture, her hands were pale with slip and she was laughing at something her instructor had said. I hadn't seen that expression on her face in a very long time. I heard the door, not a knock, the door. Desmond walked in the way someone walks into a property they've already decided to assess. He was in a wool overcoat, unhurried, immaculately put together. He scanned the kitchen, the 2 mugs, the photo on Elise's phone, the cutting board. He smiled. That smile is the thing I remember most clearly. It wasn't anger, it wasn't jealousy, it was amusement. The expression of a man who has looked at a situation and already decided how it ends. He introduced himself with a handshake that held a beat too long, and then he pulled a chair from my kitchen table and sat down, positioning himself precisely between Elise and me. He talked about the wedding at the Fairmont in Banff, the June date, the rehearsal dinner, the Thursday before. He described everything with the language of logistics, capacity, timeline, the right vendors. I watched Elise while he talked. She was holding her mug with both hands, and she wasn't looking at either of us. Then Desmond mentioned, almost as an aside, that Elise's schedule at the nonprofit was going to keep her quite occupied through spring. He said it in a tone that suggested he was doing her a favor by noting it. These little visits would probably come to a natural end, he said. Elise set her mug down. My schedule, she said. He continued. He'd had a conversation with the executive director at her organization, an old colleague of his. He'd suggested Elise might benefit from a reduced workload while she was navigating a busy season personally, just to ease the pressure. Elise said, "You talked to Renata." He turned to her with the same measured expression. "I was looking out for you." The silence that came after that was different from anything that had lived in my apartment before. It had mass. It pressed from every direction. Elise said quietly and clearly, "Go home, I'll be there shortly." Desmond stood. He smoothed his coat. He put one hand on my shoulder, heavy and deliberate, nothing to do with warmth, and said it was nothing personal, that she'd just been a bit scattered lately, and he was sure I understood. Then he walked out. The door closed with a soft, controlled click. Elise didn't speak for a moment. She sat very still with her hands flat on the island counter. Then she put her face in her hands and her shoulders started to shake, and I stood by the stove and waited. When she looked up, she told me everything. She told me in one long, unbroken account that sounded like something she'd been carrying alone for months, without anyone safe enough to set it down with. He had taken over the finances gradually, each step presented as sensible. First the joint account, then her checking redirected through it, then her RSP contributions folded into an FESPLO that required both signatures to access but only ever initiated. She had one personal account and one credit card in her own name, kept quietly. 9 months of careful saving. Everything else was his, in practice if not always on paper. He hadn't isolated her from her friends directly. He'd made it complicated. A gathering she'd planned would suddenly conflict with a booking he'd made. A call to her sister in Halifax would be interrupted, and then revisited later with quiet questions. Not accusations, just questions, about what they'd discussed and why she seemed different afterward. He had never raised his voice. There was nothing she could point to. It had just been, she said, everything around her slowly becoming his, the house, the car, her schedule, and now apparently her job, until she couldn't find the outline of herself anywhere inside it. "I'm not afraid of him," she said. "I'm afraid I waited too long. I'm afraid I let it happen because every single step seemed reasonable at the time." I said, "That's how it works." She looked at me. Her eyes were red. "I love you," she said. "I've loved you through the whole divorce and after it. I left because I thought I was too comfortable with you, too willing to let your quiet fill every room I was in. I thought if I went out into something bigger I'd grow into someone stronger, someone who didn't need as much." She paused. "But none of those rooms have felt like mine. None of those kitchens have had a cutting board with a crack in it that someone kept anyway." I sat down across from her. The light in the apartment had gone the flat gray of a late November afternoon. I didn't say I loved her back. I wanted to. Something very close to that word was true, and it had been true for a long time. But I'd been standing still for 2 years and I wasn't certain whether what I was feeling was love or the shape love leaves in a person after it's been there a long time. It seemed worth knowing the difference before I said it. What I said instead was, "I believe you, all of it." And then, "But the first step isn't toward me, it's away from him. Not for me, not for anyone else, for yourself. Do you understand what I mean?" She was quiet, then she nodded. She sat for another moment, and then she reached across the island and placed her palm flat on the cutting board, fingers spread, thumb resting against the cracked corner, and she held it there, steady, the way you hold something you've been looking for. "You kept it," she said. "It still works," I said. She stood, found her jacket, and then did something I didn't expect. She came back to the island and opened her phone. She typed for a moment and then turned the screen toward me. A list of family law clinics in Calgary, the Alberta Law Line, a few private firms. "Do you know anyone good?" she said. I thought of Terry. I texted him before Elise had her jacket buttoned. He replied in under 5 minutes with a name and a direct number. She photographed my screen, put her phone away, and left. I stood in the kitchen for a long time after the door closed. The jar of tomatoes was on the counter. The 2 mugs were still in the dish rack. The cutting board sat slightly left of center, shifted by her hands, and the crack in the corner caught the last of the evening light. What I understood, standing there, was that Desmond had been right about one thing. Elise had been coming here looking for something. He was wrong about what it was. She wasn't looking for me, exactly. She was looking for evidence that the woman who had picked up a cracked cutting board at a farmer's market and called it characterful, the woman who had chosen that specifically, characterful, still existed somewhere inside the life that had been arranged around her. She left Desmond's house 4 days later, 2 suitcases, a carry-on, and the money from the account he didn't know about. She rented a furnished basement suite in Kensington from a landlady who left paperback mysteries outside her door with sticky notes that said things like, "Don't trust the detective's assistant." I didn't reach out. Not because I didn't want to. Because I understood, in a way I might not have been capable of 2 years earlier, that if she came back to me before she knew what her own ground felt like, we'd be telling the same story again in a slightly different key. I would become the thing she leaned against before she'd learned to stand, and I cared about her too much for that. So every Saturday morning I drove to her street and left a paper bag at her door. Bread, eggs, Okanagan apples, as long as they lasted into winter, the good olive oil. 2 words text when I left the bag, front steps. I never knocked. I never waited on the sidewalk to see if she opened the door while I was still close enough to hear it. Some Saturdays I sat in my car for a few minutes after sending the text, watching the light in her front window. Then I drove home. She sent short messages, not every day. A photo of a lopsided bowl ceramics glazed a complicated gray-blue, clearly the work of someone still learning and not concerned about it. A text that just said, "Good session," which meant her therapist. Once, a picture of a yellow legal pad covered in her own handwriting. "Grocery lists," she said, which sounds like nothing until you understand it's the exact opposite of nothing. In January, the Law Society of Alberta opened a formal investigation into Desmond's firm. Overbilling, trust account irregularities, 2 corporate clients who had filed complaints in the same month. The details ran in the Calgary Herald across 3 days. His name was in the second paragraph of each story. By February, he was on administrative leave. Elise's lawyer moved fast. The separation agreement took 6 weeks. At the end of it, her RRSP was intact, her accounts were her own, and she owed Desmond nothing but the Audi she'd never liked anyway. She bought a used Subaru from a woman in Inglewood and drove herself to her own appointments, her own therapy, her own grocery runs, and she didn't check with anyone first. She told me later that the moment she actually felt free, not legally free, not paperwork free, but free in her chest, in her hands, was when she stood at a walk-in clinic in Kensington and filled out her own intake form without stopping to consider what answers someone else would have preferred. In April, she came back to my kitchen. She stood at the door in a jacket she'd bought herself, her hair a little shorter, and she was holding a paper bag. Inside, the Hutterite tomatoes and a cutting board. Maple, light and well-planed, no cracks. She held it up. "I know the crack is the part you like about yours," she said. "I didn't want to replace it. I thought maybe it needs company." I laughed, real laughter, faster than I intended, the kind that surprises you. "Come in," I said. "I'm making soup." We cooked differently than that first November night. There was no performance in it, no careful nostalgia. Elise moved around the kitchen like someone who had recently discovered she could move anywhere she wanted and was still getting used to the particular lightness of it. She talked about Gerald, her ceramics instructor, a retired art teacher from Edmonton, who played Coltrane while they worked and refused to use the word mistake. She talked about the novel her therapist had recommended, about the morning she'd walked across the Bow River Bridge at dawn for no reason except that she could, that she had nowhere to be and no one to account to. She was louder than I remembered, more certain, less careful with her sentences in the best way. When we stood at the sink afterward and her arm pressed against mine, she didn't move away, neither did I. We just stood there with the water running over our hands, close and quiet, and let the silence do what words would have made clumsy. In June, she asked if I wanted to come with her to the Inglewood Farmers Market on Saturday, not as a declaration of anything, just, did I want to come? I said yes. We walked it for 2 hours. She deliberated for 10 minutes between wildflower and buckwheat honey, then bought both because there was no reason not to. She talked to a potter for 20 minutes about firing temperatures. She ate half a peach standing over a garbage can in the sun so the juice wouldn't get on her jacket and laughed at herself for doing it. Near the end of the market, she stopped at a stall selling second-hand kitchenware. Mismatched, well-used, clearly things that had belonged to people for a long time before winding up here. She picked up a wooden spoon with a long handle and a slight warp in the neck. She turned it over in her hands. She held it out to me. "This one has been through something," she said. And I understood that she wasn't talking about the spoon. There are 2 cutting boards on my counter now. Mine, the maple with the hairline crack that caught the light on that November night when none of this had happened yet, and hers, still pale, still unmarked, still learning the shape of her hands. Every morning I make coffee and cut whatever's in season, and Elise sits at the island across from me, sideways on the stool the way she always has, ankles crossed, and we don't say very much. We don't need to. The quiet has a different shape now than it did when I was living in it alone. It isn't hollow. It has the weight of 2 people who understand how much it costs to find their way back to the same kitchen, and who have decided, without announcing it, without making a ceremony of it, to pay attention this time. If you've ever held on to something small from someone you loved, a cracked bowl, a worn-out spoon, something they left behind that you told yourself you'd get rid of and never did, not because you forgot, but because some part of you simply couldn't, I'd like to know about it. Drop it in the comments below. I read everyone.